Welcome, welcome, welcome to Leaders in Purpose. We are so glad you decided to join us today. We're going to go ahead and open with a moment of silence and respect for the elders, and then we will get on with the show. Thank you so much for joining us here with Leaders in Purpose, Caring Community Social Intelligence. Today we're going to talk about economic development, subtopic Early Omaha. We have Mr. Elijah Ali with us, who is going to discuss Early Omaha. But first, let's set the stage. We're going to set the stage with this book, With Black Labor, White Wealth, by Dr. Claude Anderson. The living condition of a people enslaved or free tend to reflect their status and power within a larger society. Legal and extra-legal measures were taken to keep both the free blacks, like the slaves, in a dependent state and excluded from enjoying the fruits of a nation that their labor was building. Free blacks were forced to survive or perish off the marginal resources that extended into their communities. One of the first lessons that free blacks learned was that without money and power, freedom for a black-skinned person was freedom in theory only. They were still bound by their conditions and non-white skin color. The Emancipation Proclamation and subsequent constitutional amendments legally freed all blacks and granted them citizenship, but without social and economic resources, these newly granted rights amounted to little more than paper rights. The government refused to compensate blacks for their prolonged servitude by providing them with the necessary tools and resources to transition from a dependent labor class to independent, competitive citizens. Instead of aiding blacks, whites exploited and urged the newly freed slaves to fend for themselves. They could work, seek public assistance, steal, or disappear. Since they were denied these things, they had no choice but to accept what the dominated society offered them, and that was sharecropping. Within the political powers, conservative forces is the bane of black society. Conservative forces are the protectors of the status quo in the good old days. After using government to amass wealth, power, and resources, conservative white power structures have long espoused social political policies that reflect their pull up the gangplank mentality. Powerful by conservatives profess commitment to capitalism and insist that their wealth stays into the hands of the private, wealthy class, which has most benefited from the inequalities in the system. They originally opposed any societal changes regarding race and resources. This placed them in direct opposition to and in conflict with blacks. Conservatives believe in a natural order of human beings and have always preferred that blacks play a servile role in society. While conservatives have consistently sought to sink black ships, liberals have simply rearranged the deck ships on the sinking ships so that blacks will be more comfortable. And the last thing, however, the core issues of white conservatism springs from race. They oppose government policies and programs that hint at the redistribution of public and private resources and power to benefit blacks. And with that, we're going to go ahead and let Mr. Elijah Ali, a long-time voice in the wilderness here in Omaha, Nebraska for over 40 years long, telling us and teaching us about the state of black society in Omaha, Nebraska, and not only in Omaha, Nebraska, but across the United States of America. Mr. Elijah Ali, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you for being here.
Can you please tell us about early Omaha and when our melanated people came here and the economic condition, and has it changed, and why you even talk about genocide, as to which that strong word genocide, as to the state of our people? Is that over-exaggerating?
No, it's kind of being nice a little bit. Because genocide, the masses of the people really aren't cognizant of the word genocide. Those who are, when you say genocide, their normal reaction is, oh, no. I said, well, what's the definition? And if you know the definition, then we fit all of the criterias. Our organization, Network for Holistic Recovery, covers what we see as the 7 principal areas of activity and development in our community. The first 3 are things that have to be done in the home, when you're born, when you're raised, and they're in their order of preference. health, education, and cultural development. Health, if you're not healthy, you're in trouble. It just kind of sets everything out of whack. If you're not educated, you're in trouble. Sets everything out of whack. If you don't know who you are, that's the cultural development, then you're in doubly bad shape. Those are the three things that individuals should acquire in their own developmental home body. When they get ready to step outside, then they'll look at human rights and human services. Human rights, what are your rights when you step outside? What can you do outside the house that you can do or you can't do at home? If you don't know those things, there needs to be human services available for you so you can do that. After that, then you can start talking about economic development and political education. Those 7 categories, we are in a genocidal state in all 7 categories: health, education, cultural development, human rights, human service, economic development, and political education. That's really something that can be really recognized in a town like Omaha. It's like one of the 3rd best test markets in the country. That's because the population is distributed somewhat evenly. The economics is so-called somewhat evenly, but there's still some big disparities here in Omaha, even as it applies to the black community. My family moved here when I was 3 years old. That was in 1947. In 1947, the railroads and the packing houses were beginning to kick off, thriving, and that's one of the main reasons why so many blacks in that particular area, particularly after World War II, came to Omaha, Nebraska. So when my father came here and we came up here. The beginning stages of black population in Omaha was somewhat dismal and non-concerning. They just had the anniversary. They say anniversary. I don't even think they should be recognizing the hanging of an individual that was accused of insulting or assaulting or doing something to a white woman. Took him out of the jail, burned the courthouse, shot the police chief, did a whole bunch of things. And we commemorated that last year, 1913. Also 1913 across the nation was identified as the Red Summer, the Blood Summer, where so many towns and so many cities just lynched and killed black people just wanting to do it, even to the point of making it celebrations. The concept of picnic came out of that same era, and picnic stands for I'll explain the rest of it for you. And it was a social activity. The part of Omaha that most blacks moved into was North Omaha. When you talk about a certain area, it can be identified sometimes as a cultural area, and the 24th and Lake area has been identified as a cultural district. In order to do that, you have to file a document, and in that document, it states that in the early 1900s, going into the beginning of that decade, about 4,000 blacks that were wealthy in the downtown 14th and Dodge area, because of the segregation law that was enforced in 1913, moved in the 24th and Lake area. By chance, it just so happened that summer also, a tornado came in and cleaned out the whole area, so they had to come in and almost redevelop it. Remember, that document said blacks who were somewhat wealthy in the 14th and Dodge area moved into that area. Then it goes on to state that the middle of the, going into the 1920s, 1930s, an additional 7,000 African Americans from the South came into Omaha. And in reading that, you wonder why they were identified as blacks in the first part and then as African Americans in the second part. And that was because the Hebraic community, which are sometimes known as Jewish community, because of their ethnicity being Hebraic, was identified in their legal documents, were also forced to move into that area also. But they were wealthy. They built schools and stores and hospitals and everything, and solicited to the blacks in the South to come up and live in that area, which caused for Omaha to be kind of a, for those who are familiar with the Tulsa, actually Omaha was probably a little more progressive than even Tulsa, but it was because it was developed by the Hebraic community.
Who were considered African Americans, and then the blacks were the ones who migrated up here.
They were considered as blacks.
Okay, the Hebraic Jews were considered blacks.
As blacks, right. Which caused for the education to be much higher than most cities, for the opportunity, the business opportunities to be much better, and just kind of a good place to live. Then along came the 60s with the Civil Rights era and all the other kinds of activities of awakening, and the majority of that Hebraic community, the older ones had already moved out and moved north. For an example, in I think it was like 58, a large portions of the white community that lived also in that area moved out because of the school system, and that's what created District 66 schools. And so that left the school district isolated away from the normal flow of money again. So the books and the educational equipment and all those things were depressed. Here again, the older Hebraic community had already moved out. Few stores, which they owned, they kept them going for a while, pawn shops and things like that. But the masses had moved out and left the community totally African American and desolate.
You mean black?
Black, right.
Totally black, because the Hebraic Jews were considered African American.
No, the Hebraic were considered as being black.
Black, and we who migrated.
African Americans, which were the descendants of slaves coming into the area, were left there to fend for themselves. Okay. The railroads and the packing houses both were all shut down by 1974 totally. They began shutting down in 64, so that 10-year period of time between 64 and 74 was the desolation period. For an example, even HUD, because it was by law segregated, HUD was responsible to redevelop the area to where it should be, and they never did that. One main thing was the sewer separation, of which they just did 4 or 5 years ago. Back in the 70s, when they were supposed to have done it, the government would have paid for it and they'd had to get it done, but they didn't do that for many reasons. One, they didn't want to build up the area because it was predominantly black. They knew, according to their scheme of things, that the gentrification would occur. And so from that time up until 5 years ago, when they did do the sewers, and they only did it because the government told them that they had to do it by law because the sewage was going into the Missouri and contaminating the water further on down, so they had to do it. But they made them do it and didn't give them the money that they would have given to them when if they did it in the 70s, which has caused for the water bills and the other utility bills to be as high as they are, so that they have to pay for those kinds of things. So the overall disparities of the community have almost totally dissipated the population. There's probably only like tops 45,000 blacks in North Omaha at all, in this whole city. And that wouldn't even fill up half of Nebraska's football stadium. Wow. So the population here, there are no businesses. Those that are around are struggling. 5 of the 7 schools in our area are the lowest in the country. Daycares and those kinds of things were all shut down, so they put the EduCare program in. So now they educate our kids at 3, and they don't come out of the system until they're 18 or 25. I say 25 because those who like in foster care, which is a large number, they've already found out that the abilities of those kids aging out of foster care is so low, the blacks, that they had to change it. Well, they didn't change how they operated foster care, they changed the age. They changed the age from 18 to 25. Now you can go into the system at 3 and be in it until you're 25, which is cradle to prison. Yeah. And that's where we're at. And folks don't like to hear it, but I wish somebody could prove me wrong.
Now, all dire Are there any resources that we could go to, like the Omaha Chamber of Commerce, the HUD, the other Urban League, other agencies that we can go to help fix these disparities? If so, why and why not?
There are no organizations, whether they are identified as black or white, of any magnitude, I'm talking about anything that serves over 12 people, that are proficient enough to deal with the needs that we have. There was when Health and Human Services was shutting down their case management section, they had to find out what organizations would be proficient enough to take over that load. And they put together what they call the Eastern Nebraska Community Network, of which myself and another gentleman who's involved in the community activity, Jamal Bindon, served on. And after about 4 months of evaluating the organizations in this community, we found that there were no organizations, and here again, this is 2004, 2005 that we did that. At that time, there were no organizations that were equipped to handle the caseload that Health and Human Services had been handled. So what they did is that they transferred predominantly all the black caseloads over to the Goodwill. And the reason they transferred over to the Goodwill, because the Goodwill was the only organization that was equipped to handle education and the development of those who are mentally retarded. And that was the reason why they did that. And that's the only reason they did that, because no one else could even come close to handling it, and that speaks for itself on where we're at. And that's why some of the demographics, the employment, Nebraska, particularly Omaha, jumps up and down about their unemployment rates is like 2 point something, one of the lowest in the country. But the unemployment in the African American community is still well over 24, 25%, and that's based on their demographics, which does not include those who don't register for unemployment at all. So it could very well be up in the 40s. And there are some statistics that show that the unemployment of blacks in Omaha is in the 40s, if not higher than that. So no businesses, no development, a large portion of youth. You spoke about the Urban League and the Chamber of Commerce. So a large portion of youth about 5 years ago, not youth, but young adults going into the working field who were leaving Omaha. And it was so traumatic that they wanted to do a study. So they asked the Chamber of Commerce to do it. The Chamber of Commerce did it and turned it over to the Urban League. And that's still where it's at. No quarry, no information, no dialogue, no anything. There's organizations that do some types of studies on an ongoing basis to see where we really are, and they place our unemployment rate around 40%, and they think that's pretty good, but it's still genocidal, particularly if you ain't got any money.
Wow. When looking at the despair that, Elijah, that you talk about, Dr. Claude Anderson also addresses that in Black Labor and White Wealth, as well as some other books that we as a people can read to help ourselves to get some advice on how to handle these situations. Black Labor and White Wealth by Dr. Claude Anderson. Randall Robinson, What Blacks Owe to Each Other, The Reckoning. Powernomics, The National Plan to Empower Black People by Dr. Claude Anderson. Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, Unequal by Dr. Andrew Hacker. And Should American Pay? Slavery and the Raging Debate on Reparations. And contributors include Malifi Kete Asante, John Coyers Jr., Christopher Hitchens, Hakai R. Manhubiti, John McWhorter, Deidre C. Farmer Pellman, and Shelby Steele. Some other good DVDs to look at would be The Huge Potential of the Black Race by Brother Delzino Wilson Debriano. It says the black race has achieved great things throughout history and is capable of much more. In this groundbreaking presentation, learn what happened to the potential of our great African race and learn truth about our race that you could never even suspected before. Learn about the huge potential that we possess today, as well as victories of the black race and their key to successes and the $1 trillion game they don't want black people to know about. Mr. Elijah Ali, as far as the businesses and dealing with this disparity. I remember our own Honorable Senator Ernie Chambers, and he said that unfortunately integration was one of the worst things that we could have done. Looking at that from a social and from a moral standpoint, we may agree, but looking at it from a economic and a social standpoint, does that hold any truth?
Yeah, that's where the genocide comes in. Every situation where after slavery, and we can only count after slavery, and that for all practical purposes didn't really end. We talk about 1865, but the ability for a people with no direction, no financial support, no educational mechanisms to develop was ludicrous. We still were able to, in certain parts of the country, go into those areas and begin to thrive. The migrating habits that went into the east and to the early part of the Midwest, I'll say up into Chicago, those outcomes were so mispresented through entertainment mechanisms and other types of communication mechanisms, because we don't have any control of any communications, except for in the early stages we had some newspaper, but they still don't have much gravity if you don't read. You can look at pictures like Jet magazine and Ebony magazine. Those were all mostly pictures. Very few people were really able to read the stories. They gave us a false illusion to exactly where we were at that time and where we were going. Like I said, we hear about some of the places in Florida that were burned and blown up. Tulsa, they're just now really beginning to dramatize that piece, and I think the reason they're doing that to let people know that it's probably going to happen again if you try to do the same thing again, because some of our major cities are so heavily populated with black people that just the normal inner trappings of things that we use, like liquor stores and small corner stores, of which the most time sell more alcohol and other illegal mechanisms than food and groceries, the thing we need for subsistence. Those types of things are really still with us. They don't get away. And as we begin to try to develop in certain locales, we don't have the financial background. They're putting out now how just veterans coming out of the service weren't able to take advantage of the veterans' rights for home ownership. Home ownership allows you also the ability to garner revenue, because if you own them, then you can invest into them and move on, use them for rent and become economic base. And like I'm saying, there's several pieces that are just now coming about how banks were strategic and not allowing blacks to have home ownership. One of the organizations in our town right now, Omaha Family Housing Advisory Service, one of their missions is to help people get their credit to the point where they can acquire home ownership. Well, that's fine if they do that, but if the banks still don't give them that, all that is for waste. And that's one of the major things right now. You can see the way that a lot of these organizations that are supposed to be doing kinds of things haven't been able to do it, because the outcomes of them are so atrocious that they all fall to the wayside. So there's no mechanisms in place right now to aid descendants of slaves to get out of the situation that we're in. And that's why the prison rate higher today. There are more blacks in prison today than there were slaves in 1865. So those kinds of things let you know where we're at and where we're going. The period of time between in the 1980, they call it the overcrowded, the disproportionate number of black males that were incarcerated. That was in 1980. A lot of those came out of Nam because they had those kinds of skills out of Vietnam. They were soldiers. When they had those kinds of skills, they also had certain kinds of addictions, because that was one of the main reasons for the Vietnam War in the first place. They were neutralized, which caused by 1990 females going to prison 300% over and above the norm. 2000 to 2010, an increase in young males again, the same as in 1980. And now in 2010 to 2020, an increase in females. So we're talking about kids that are anywhere between 12 to 16 years old that are going to jail with adult charges. The number of shootings of young people doing on young people. That's the genocide we are perpetrating on ourselves because of a lack of education, drugs being free in the streets, guns being free in the streets, and no parental. 72% of all black households across the country are single head. That's the kind of situation we're in, and we still think everything is real on television. So that's all we do is sit and watch television.
Thank you so much for joining Leaders in Purpose, Caring Community Social Intelligence with Mr. Elijah Ali, Network for Holistic Recovery, and myself, Ms. CeCe Alexander. And please stay tuned as we continue not only to talk, but to work with organizations and talk to people in position who are determined to address these factors and to change it for the better of the melanated nation who built America and other parts of the world. Thank you so much for joining. We want to thank you, Chris Craddock, KPAO, Mike Wallace, Thaddeus Wilkins, who did my introduction. We appreciate you and we love you all, my audience, and every viewer, and even every critic. Please let us know what you're thinking. Peace, power, and blessings and prosperity. Bye-bye.